sweeping through the Lakota encampment with a bitter, restless energy. Dark clouds loomed on the horizon, pregnant with the promise of a storm. Inside a buffalo hide lodge near the center of the village, Chaska sat cross-legged, his fingers idly tracing the patterns on his tomahawk handle. His father's words still rang in his ears. The settlers are taking too much. Their hands are stained with the blood of our people. That woman will pay for what her kind has done. Chaska clenched his jaw. The elders had spoken. At dawn, the white woman, Eliza Carter, would die. Beyond the lodge walls, the village pulsed with quiet anticipation. Warriors sharpened their weapons. Women tended to their fires, casting fleeting glances toward the tent where the captive was kept. Even the children, usually full of laughter, played in hushed tones, as if the night itself demanded silence. Chaska's heart pounded. He had fought alongside his people. He had watched his kin fall beneath the rifles of blue-coated soldiers, seen the lifeless bodies of mothers and children left in the wake of a settler's raid. He understood the anger that coursed through the village like an unspoken law. But as he closed his eyes, he did not see the faces of the fallen. He saw hers, Eliza Carter. He had only glimpsed her once. When they dragged her into the village, her wrists bound, her long brown hair matted with dust. She had not wept, had not begged. She had stood tall, her chin lifted in quiet defiance even as the people cursed her. That defiance had unsettled Chaska more than he cared to admit. A woman who did not fear death was either foolish or stronger than the men who condemned her. The lodge flap stirred, and a shadow darkened the entrance. His father, Chief Lakota, stepped inside, his expression carved from stone. "You linger," Lakota observed, his deep voice edged with warning. Chaska met his father's gaze. "There is no honor in killing a woman, father." Lakota exhaled sharply, as if disappointed. "Honor? Was there honor when our villages burned? When your mother and sister were slaughtered?" Chaska's grip tightened around his tomahawk. The memories stabbed deep, a wound that never fully closed. He had been young when the settlers came, when his mother's screams were drowned beneath the thunder of gunfire. "No," he admitted, "there was no honor then. But will her death bring them back?" Lakota studied his son, his dark eyes unreadable. "Her death will remind them that we are not weak, that we do not forget." Chaska did not answer. He had been raised to follow, to obey. But something inside him twisted against the weight of expectation. As his father turned to leave, he hesitated at the entrance. "At dawn it will be done. Do not shame me by questioning it further." The lodge flap fell shut. Chaska sat motionless, listening to the distant roll of thunder. His father's words made sense. The world they lived in was not built for mercy. And yet, the idea of killing a woman, unarmed and helpless, gnawed at him like a sickness. The village fires burned low. The night stretched long and silent. Chaska rose. His feet carried him without thought. Past the dozing warriors, past the lodges of sleeping families. The captive's tent was smaller than the others, guarded by two men slumped against the wooden posts, their bodies lax with exhaustion. Chaska crouched low, testing the wind. A storm was coming. It would drown out sound, mass movement. Lightning flashed, illuminating the tent's entrance for a brief moment. Then darkness reclaimed the night. With the grace of a hunter, he slipped inside. The air smelled of damp earth and sweat. A small figure sat near the back, hands still bound, her head tilted upward as if she sensed him before he had even spoken. "You move like a ghost," she murmured, her voice hoarse from thirst. Chaska hesitated. He had expected defiance, maybe even pleading, but her tone was calm, resigned. "You should be asleep," he said. She let out a dry laugh. "Difficult, knowing I'll be dead by sunrise." For the first time, he saw her up close, pale skin smudged with dirt, high cheekbones bruised from rough hands. But her eyes, green as pine needles after rain, were sharp and unwavering. "You don't want to kill me." It wasn't a question. Chaska shifted his weight. "What makes you so sure?" Eliza tilted her head. "Because you're here." Silence stretched between them. Rain began to patter softly against the tent, the storm finally breaking. "If I free you," Chaska said slowly, "can you run?" Something flickered in her expression. Hope, disbelief. Then it hardened. I'd rather die running than kneeling. Chaska pulled his knife from his belt, slicing through the bindings at her wrists. She flinched as the rope fell away, rubbing the raw skin beneath. Outside, a distant voice called out. The guards were stirring. Chaska met her gaze. We leave now. Eliza nodded, already moving. Together, they slipped into the storm. The night swallowed them whole. Rain poured in torrents, turning the earth beneath their feet into a treacherous mire. Chaska moved swiftly, his steps light and measured, but Eliza struggled to match his pace. Her boots sank into the mud, and more than once she stumbled, her breath coming in sharp gasps. He reached for her, steadying her arm without breaking stride. Behind them, the village stirred. A shout split the night. One of the guards had woken. The alarm would spread like wildfire. Lightning cracked overhead, revealing the world in ghostly flashes. Trees loomed ahead, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky. Chaska veered toward them, pulling Eliza into the dense undergrowth. The storm was their shield, masking their tracks, but it wouldn't last forever. Keep moving, he urged. She nodded, though he could hear the strain in her breath. The ground sloped downward. Chaska guided them toward a shallow ravine, its rocky bed slick with rain. He paused for the briefest moment, scanning the landscape. Beyond the ravine, the land stretched wide and open, too exposed. If they were spotted in the grasslands, they would not last long. The only option was to push deeper into the forest, where the trees would conceal them. A distant war cry rose above the storm. Eliza stiffened. They're coming! Chaska took her hand, ignoring the jolt of warmth at the contact. Then we moved faster. They descended the ravine, the stones loose beneath their feet. Eliza slipped, catching herself on her hands. She hissed in pain, but pushed forward without complaint. Chaska stole a glance over his shoulder. Shadows flickered along the ridge, torches sputtering in the rain. Warriors moved like wraiths through the storm, their voices blending with the thunder. His father's men, his own kin. Regret was a poison that had no place here. He forced it down and pressed on. They reached the tree line just as arrows hissed through the air, striking bark and stone. Eliza let out a sharp cry, ducking instinctively. Chaska pulled her deeper into the woods, weaving between trees with practiced ease. The forest closed around them, a tangle of roots and mist. Rain dripped from the canopy, dampening their scent. Chaska knew these lands well, knew where the rivers twisted and where the ground could swallow a man whole. If they could reach the old hunting grounds by dawn, they had a chance. Eliza moved in silence beside him, her earlier exhaustion masked by sheer determination. He risked a glance at her, surprised by the steel in her eyes. "You don't scare easy," he murmured. She didn't look at him. "I don't have that luxury." A branch snapped behind them. Chaska halted, hand tightening around his tomahawk. Eliza froze, her breath shallow. Through the curtain of rain, shapes emerged. 3, maybe 4. Not Lakota. These men moved differently, their steps heavy with greed, not vengeance. Bounty hunters. A new kind of threat, but no less deadly. Chaska gestured for Eliza to stay low. He crouched, pressing himself against the gnarled roots of an ancient tree. The bounty hunters advanced, their rifles slung over their shoulders, their faces obscured by the storm. One of them muttered something in English. Chaska understood enough to piece together the intent. They weren't here for the fight. They were here for the reward. One of the men, taller than the rest, knelt in the mud, running his fingers through the disturbed earth. He grinned. "She's close," he murmured. Chaska's grip tightened on his weapon. He could take them, silent, swift, but not without risking injury, and an injury now was a death sentence later. He glanced at Eliza. She had pressed herself into the shadows, her body still as stone, her fingers wrapped around a jagged rock. She was ready to fight, a gun cocked. "Come on out, sweetheart," the tall man called, his voice thick with amusement. "We know you're here. No sense in running. The Lakota want you dead, but us, we're reasonable men." Chaska inhaled slowly, his mind calculating. They needed a diversion. His gaze flicked to the branches overhead. An idea took shape. He met Eliza's eyes. She nodded, understanding without words. Chaska moved first, a blur in the rain. He vaulted up the tree, his bare feet finding purchase on the slick bark. The bounty hunters didn't see him. Not yet. Their focus remained on the ground, searching for signs of movement. Eliza, bracing herself, let out a sharp cry into the rock. It struck the tall man square in the head. He staggered, cursing. "There!" another one shouted. They turned toward her. Chaska struck. He dropped from a tree like a phantom, landing behind the nearest man. His tomahawk flashed, the blunt end cracking against the back of the hunter's skull. The man crumpled. Eliza lunged for another, driving her knee into his gut before scrambling away. The third bounty hunter raised his rifle, but Chaska was faster, twisting the weapon from his hands and using the momentum to slam the stock against his ribs. Thunder rumbled. The fight lasted seconds. The bounty hunters lay groaning in the mud, their weapons scattered. Eliza exhaled sharply, eyes wide. "We need to go." Chaska nodded. "Now." They vanished into the storm, leaving the bounty hunters behind. The night stretched on, the rain never ceasing. Their escape was far from over. The storm had passed, leaving the world sodden and silent. Mist curled to the underbrush, rising like ghosts from the damp earth. Chaska and Eliza pressed forward, their footsteps muffled by the softened ground. They had run through the night, crossing streams and cutting through dense foliage, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the men who hunted them. Now, with the first light of dawn bleeding through the canopy, exhaustion pressed down on them both. Chaska slowed near a thicket of pine, his sharp eyes scanning the landscape. Here, the land dipped into a hollow, a natural refuge hidden from view. It would have to do. "We rest here," he said. Eliza exhaled, sinking onto a fallen log. She pulled her knees to her chest, rubbing her wrists where the rope had left red welts. Chaska remained standing, listening. The forest had a rhythm, a pulse. The night's chaos had disturbed it, but now the birds had begun their morning song. That meant, for now, they were alone. Eliza broke the silence. "How far will they chase us?" He hesitated. "Far." She let out a bitter laugh. "That's reassuring." Chaska glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "You are the first captive to escape the village. My father will not let that stand." Eliza's fingers tightened around her arms. "So what happens when they catch us?" He didn't answer. There was no need. They both knew the outcome. For a long moment, they sat in silence, the only sound the distant rustling of the wind through the trees. Then Eliza sighed and leaned back against a log. "You should have left me behind." Chaska turned toward her, brow furrowed. "You wanted to live." She shook her head. "I wanted to die on my terms." There was no self-pity in her tone, no trembling weakness, just a statement of fact. Chaska studied her, seeing beyond the dirt and bruises. There was something in her gaze that unsettled him, something he recognized. "You've lost people," he said. Eliza met his stare. "And you haven't?" The question hung between them. Chaska sat across from her, resting his arms on his knees. The dawn's light softened his features, casting shadows beneath his eyes. "My mother and sister were killed when I was a boy. White men came in the night, burned our lodge. My father found me hiding in the smoke." Eliza listened, unmoving. Chaska's voice remained even. "I've fought settlers since I was old enough to hold a bow. Hated them. But I looked into your eyes and saw no killer." He studied her. "Have I been wrong before?" She hesitated. "I don't know." Chaska's gaze held hers, unwavering. "Did you burn our villages?" Eliza inhaled sharply. "No." "Did you kill our women and children?" "No." Chaska nodded. "Then I was not wrong." Eliza let out a slow breath, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her tattered dress. "My father was a farmer. We lived far from fighting. We never wanted any part of it. Then the war came, and soldiers forced men like him to choose a side. They called it protection. But in the end, it didn't matter. The war didn't care who you were. It just swallowed you whole." Chaska listened in silence. She swallowed hard, her voice growing softer. My father was shot when the soldiers raided our homestead. My mother and brother were taken. I don't know if they lived. After that, I was forced to marry a man I despised, a man who thought a ring gave him ownership. When your people attacked our settlement, I ran. I didn't care who found me. I just wanted to be free. Chaska watched her closely. She spoke with no plea for pity, no tears, only the quiet resignation of someone who had endured too much. For the first time, she turned the question on him. Have you ever wanted to escape? Chaska looked away, his jaw tightening. A warrior does not run. Eliza studied him. But you did. He exhaled through his nose. Not for myself. She shifted, hugging her knees tighter. Then why? He met her gaze, and this time his answer came without hesitation. Because my heart said it was right. Silence settled between them, but it was no longer tense. It was something else, something unspoken but understood. Eliza tilted her head back, staring up at the sky. The first golden rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, warming the damp air. She let out a small breath, almost a laugh. You know, I never expected to die sitting beside a Lakota warrior and talking about our pasts. Chaska smirked, a rare expression on his usually stern face. Then we are both surprised. For the first time, the corners of her lips curved into something resembling a smile. A branch snapped in the distance. Chaska's expression darkened instantly. He was on his feet before the sound had fully registered, his tomahawk in hand. Eliza's breath caught. Is it them? Chaska motioned for silence, tilting his head toward the trees. He listened, his senses sharpening. The sound was different. Not the disciplined movements of Lakota warriors, nor the heavy-footed bounty hunters. This was something else. Then, a shadow moved between the trees. A lone figure emerged, tall and broad-shouldered, his face partially obscured by war paint and the deep hood of his cloak. His gaze locked onto Chaska, unblinking. Eliza stiffened. Friend or enemy? Chaska's grip on his weapon did not ease. His voice was quiet, steady. Neither. The man took another step forward, rainwater dripping from the edges of his cloak. Then he spoke, his voice rough, like a blade dulled by years of use. You're far from home, Chaska. Eliza looked between them. You know him? Chaska's expression was unreadable. Yes. The stranger's dark eyes flicked toward Eliza, assessing, calculating. Then he turned back to Chaska. You have made a dangerous choice, brother. Chaska said nothing. The man took another step forward, his face now fully visible. Eliza tensed. Who is he? Chaska exhaled, lowering his weapon slightly. His name is White Wolf. The stranger studied them both before speaking again. And you are being hunted. White Wolf's gaze was unreadable as he stood between the trees, his body motionless, yet exuding an air of quiet menace. The rain had lessened to a fine mist, and in its wake, the forest had fallen into an eerie silence. Chaska did not lower his weapon. You followed us. White Wolf studied him for a long moment before speaking. Your father sent me. Eliza stiffened. Chaska's fingers flexed around the handle of his tomahawk, his pulse hammering against his ribs. To bring me back? He asked. White Wolf's lips curled into something between a smirk and a sigh. To see if you would return willingly. He glanced at Eliza, his expression unreadable, and to see if she still lived. Eliza met his gaze without flinching. I'm not dead yet. White Wolf tilted his head slightly. Not yet, he murmured. Chaska exhaled, his mind racing. If his father had sent White Wolf instead of a hunting party, it meant he wanted his son to make a choice, one final test of loyalty, or perhaps a warning. White Wolf's eyes darkened. You know they will come. Chaska nodded. Yes. Eliza looked between them. How many? White Wolf turned his gaze toward the distant ridgeline. 12 warriors. Maybe more. Maddo leads them. At the mention of his brother's name, something inside Chaska tightened. Maddo was ruthless, loyal to their father's cause without question. He would not hesitate to finish what the tribe had started. White Wolf folded his arms. You cannot run. The storm bought you time, but the hunt does not stop. Chaska knew he was right. The forest would not protect them forever. Eliza straightened. Then we don't run. Chaska looked at her. Her face was pale, streaked with dirt, but her eyes burned with quiet determination. We make our stand, she said. White Wolf let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. The woman has a warrior spirit. Chaska turned to him. Will you fight with us? White Wolf's smirk faded. He was silent for a long time. Then, with a sigh, he pulled free the knife strapped to his waist and twirled it between his fingers. It seems I have no choice. The decision was made. They moved quickly, preparing for the inevitable battle. Chaska scouted the terrain, mapping the high ground and the narrow choke points that could slow their enemies. White Wolf set traps, hidden snares, sharpened stakes buried beneath the leaves. Eliza, despite her exhaustion, gathered stones, wielding them as weapons where she could. By the time the sun crested the horizon, the forest had become their battleground. The first war cry shattered the morning air. Chaska's heart pounded as he crouched behind a fallen tree, his grip tightening on his tomahawk. Mado's warriors emerged from the trees, their bows drawn, their eyes blazing with fury. Eliza, he called. She ducked behind the rocks just as the first arrow streaked through the air. White Wolf moved like a shadow, slashing to the undergrowth with brutal precision. A warrior lunged at him, but he twisted, driving his knife into the man's gut before disappearing back into the trees. Chaska saw Mado then, standing at the edge of the clearing, his spear raised high. His brother's eyes locked onto his, filled not with rage, but something worse, disappointment. Chaska rose from his cover, stepping into the open. The world seemed to slow. You would fight against your own people? Mado's voice carried over chaos. Chaska met his gaze. I would fight for what is right. Mado's jaw clenched. Then you are no longer my brother. He charged. Chaska barely had time to brace before Mado's spear swung toward him. He ducked, feeling the wind of the strike against his cheek. He countered, driving his tomahawk toward Mado's ribs, but his brother twisted away, quick as a snake. They moved in brutal rhythm, neither yielding, neither hesitating. A sudden scream tore through the air. Chaska's head snapped toward the sound. Eliza, one of Mado's warriors, had grabbed her, dragging her toward the trees. She fought, kicking and clawing, but he was stronger. Chaska's blood ran cold. Mado took advantage of the distraction, striking hard. The force of the blow sent Chaska crashing to the ground, his breath knocked from his lungs. His tomahawk slipped from his grasp. Mado loomed over him, spear raised. This is your last chance, he said. Come home. Chaska stared up at him. His brother's face was carved from stone, but deep in his eyes there was something else, a plea. For one brief moment he saw them as children again, chasing each other through the tall grass, their mother's laughter echoing in the wind. But that life was gone. He grabbed a fistful of mud and flung it into Mado's eyes. His brother recoiled, stumbling back, and Chaska lunged. He tackled him, sending them both rolling across the ground. Mado's spear went flying. They crashed into the underbrush, grappling like wild animals. Chaska's fist struck hard. Mado fought back, but Chaska did not relent. Then he had the knife in his hand, pressed against his brother's throat. Mado's chest heaved, his face bruised, blood dripping from his lip. He did not move, did not beg. Do it, he whispered. Chaska's fingers trembled. For a long, agonizing moment, he hovered on the edge of a choice that would change everything. Then, slowly, he pulled the knife away. Mado's eyes widened slightly. Chaska stood, breath ragged. I will not kill my brother. Behind them, a loud crack rang through the air. Chaska turned in time to see Eliza smash a rock against her captor's skull. The warrior crumpled. She staggered back, breathless, her hands shaking. The battle was over. The remaining warriors hesitated, their eyes flicking between Mado and Chaska. They waited for an order, but none came. Mado slowly pushed himself to his feet. He met Chaska's gaze one last time. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away. One by one, the others followed. White Wolf stepped forward, shaking his head. You are either the bravest man I have ever known or the most foolish. Chaska let out a breath. Perhaps both. Eliza wiped a hand across her face. Is it over? Chaska looked at the horizon, where the warriors had vanished into the trees. "No," he said quietly, "but we are free." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain. White Wolf turned toward the mountains. "I go my own way now." Chaska nodded. "Then may the spirits guide you." White Wolf gave a rare smile. "And you, brother." Then he was gone. Chaska and Eliza stood in silence, watching the sun rise over the forest. Eliza exhaled. "What now?" Chaska looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Now we decide who we become." And together they walked into the unknown.